So I played through the episodic Resident Evil Revelations 2, and I was pretty excited about this title because I had heard that it was a return to horror or getting more, making it more horror-like or horrific or whatever, and returning to the roots. And I mean, I think Capcom basically admitted that they saw Resident Evil as an action franchise, because I think, to some extent, that makes sense. Horror, I don't think, is super mainstream. If you look at, like, top-grossing movies, there aren't any horror movies up there. I mean, there's definitely very popular horror movies, but I think if you're trying to achieve mass market success, horror is not the, genre. I mean, obviously, horror games can be very successful. The original Resident Evil, and like Five Nights at Freddy's sold incredibly well. But, I mean, if you look at, let's say Five Nights at Freddy's sold, 1 million or 2 million copies, right? Like, if you look at that, like, Alien Isolation sold 2 million copies, and they're probably disappointed with that, and I've talked about that in other developer diaries. So, I mean, like, really, you have to move, millions of units to justify a AAA game. So I can totally understand that Capcom wants to make the Resident Evil franchise action-y, and maybe you'll all hate me for saying this, but I enjoyed Resident Evil 5, right? Like, I had a great time playing it. I played through it co-op with a friend, and I played through it co-op later with my wife. And, she really enjoyed it. And so when I pitched her to the idea of Revelations 2, she was on board, and I was excited to be able to play through the game for her. The problem is that the co-op is basically one player who can shoot, and then another player who can do next to nothing. Basically solve a few puzzles and progress the story a little bit here and there. And my wife decided that she would rather not play than play a boring character. So I mean, like, the premise of co-op is it seems like that they probably misjudge things if someone would rather not play than play the game. And certainly I can understand where she's coming from. And I mean, she's not really into horror, and I mean, even I'm very into horror. I didn't find Revelations 2 that scary. I didn't really think it had, the same atmosphere of the early Resident Evils, and I can't really quite put my finger on why the atmosphere wasn't there. I mean, I don't know. I probably should have thought of that more before before recording this. But yeah, it just, I don't know. I mean, I think co-op to some extent makes things a little less scary. The characters have, banter and whatnot, and the everything seemed kind of generic, and you could tell that this was not, a huge project at Capcom. This was not something they were really putting a lot of development muscle behind. Like, the graphics aren't super great for a next-gen game, which, I mean, it's also released on last-gen, but, I mean, there's been some, cross-gen games like Alien Isolation that look awesome on the current-gen. And, the co-op is a little annoying because basically, instead of splitting the screen, they basically do a 16:9 window for each player. And there are some other games, I think, like Uncharted co-op or something did this. And I think the real trick is basically they're trying to reduce fill rate, because split screen is more performance intensive. You basically have to render two completely different areas of the scene, of the world, which means different textures, different models, and so it's definitely slower from a performance standpoint, and so they try to mitigate this by reducing fill rate. So when there's just black on the screen, it's almost guaranteed that that's a fill rate reduction trick. Like, I think that was to improve the Evil Within's frame rate. I mean, they say that it was to make it look cinematic, but I bet, one of the engineers said, hey, we could really get our frame rate up if we put black bars here, or maybe that was from the beginning. Although, they apparently patched that out, which I'm curious to see how much that affected the frame rate. I suspect that, on like PlayStation 4, you'll see a drop in performance, but I don't know, I haven't messed around with it yet. But anyway, so the multiplayer wasn't great, and it didn't really add to the horror, and also the graphics seemed, I don't know if they were using lower poly models for split screen, which sometimes they do. I think, like, especially like N64 days, or maybe not N64 days, but like PS2 days, sometimes they would just have like reduced poly versions of everything for split screen, which I don't think polygons are the main bandwidth. I think it's more about fill rate, but maybe they have like cut the texture res or reduce the shader complexity or something. But or maybe it was just the display was smaller. But like it looked better when I was running full screen. It didn't look amazing. But like it's just pretty standard stuff. Standard combat. Standard. Puzzles. There was the co-op element. One of the characters can only do certain things. The story wasn't overly interesting, although what was significant about the story, at least to me, is there's a point, it's split into 4 chapters, and I think that they did something interesting episodically in that they finished it all at once, and then they released the episode once every 2 weeks. And of course I came in late to the party and just got the game when it was finished, but I think that's sort of an interesting way to release an episodic game, somewhat similar to how they do it on TV shows, right? I don't think they're filming the TV shows in a week, right? I think only like South Park can do that. They just film them and then release them once a week, and so I think that's an interesting approach to game development. And the story worked okay episodically, but my main complaint was, in episode 3, there's a seemingly arbitrary decision that basically causes you to get a terrible ending, or the good regular ending. Now, I, of course, screwed up and got the terrible ending, and then that really rubbed me the wrong way, because I was like, oh, I really want to get the good ending. But basically, and there's even like, you miss out on part of the boss fight too, if you get the bad ending, which totally sucks, because then, not only is it not emotionally fulfilling, but I missed out on gameplay. So I was thinking about doing it, but like, in looking at the playtimes, I think I'd have to replay about like 3 hours of content, which wasn't like amazing, super interesting content, to get the better ending. Versus watching it on YouTube. And of course I watched it on YouTube. But like, the whole thing rubbed me the wrong way, I think. The fact that the decision point was more or less arbitrary and 3 hours ago. And I think that's sort of a risk or a problem when you're doing multiple endings. And there's some, like Silent Hill, like, some of them, are based on your behavior for the entire game. And then, but usually it's like theme and variation of the same thing. And, if you're doing bad things, then you'll get a bad ending or something. But, usually, I guess maybe I was playing those with a walkthrough. So I knew what to do, whereas Revelation, I didn't really have to use a walkthrough very much. But basically, yeah, I was really bitter that I got the bad ending, and then I was like, oh, well, let me play more, and then I was like, maybe not. And there's 2, like, bonus episodes if you get the season pass, and I played through 1, and it wasn't very interesting. Although I yeah, it basically covers like a certain stretch of the character that's sort of predicated on the idea that you have the good ending. So I felt like I was almost redeeming myself by playing this other thing in terms of not getting the good ending. But like, then functionally that's really weird though, because basically I was playing content that led up to other content which I didn't even see. So I don't know, the whole bad ending thing just blows my mind, you know, why they did it that way. And because, I mean, it really left a bad taste in my mouth, you know, for the game, which, I mean, the game wasn't amazing. I do like that, you know, they were trying to make it a little more horrific. I don't think they succeeded, but, I mean, it was less about, you know, super uppercutting zombies, and you know, you had to do a little more resource management and play things a little safer, I think, than the other Resident Evils. So, I mean, I don't know, you know, what that means in the scope of the franchise if this game was deemed successful, but, I mean, it would be interesting, I mean, if other than just re-releasing old Resident Evils, and I assume they're making, you know, some super action blockbuster, you know, Resident Evil 7, but it would be neat if they were to create, you know, more horror, horrific Resident Evils, you know, for the old fans. Although I suspect that if you like the horror games, we're stuck with, you know, basically remasters. I think they've already announced a remaster of Resident Evil 0, and that's sort of the next game on the slate, and I assume it's going to be similar to the most recent remaster of Resident Evil. So it's based on like a GameCube game, but with the graphics redone, new renders for the static backgrounds and everything. So anyway, thanks for watching.